Hello, everyone. This is Benjamin Yoder with One Controller Port. I did a panel at LVLUP Expo in 2023, which unfortunately I forgot to record the audio on, so it is lost to time for that. However, I did want to go ahead and do a online version of this panel for anyone who would be curious in seeing it after the fact. So basically, I'm doing this in post after the panel itself, but I thought I'd go ahead and go through it. So the topic I covered is how to better discuss and appreciate video games. And the reason I want to talk about this is because, I'm somebody who has been talking about video games for a very long time. I've been talking to people about video games, throughout school, to family, to friends, to random strangers online in forums, Reddit, Twitter, all those things, right? So I've had a lot of different experiences with talking to people online. And I also have played a lot of very different types of games. And I feel like I've really kind of expanded well beyond, the types of games I used to play, 5 to 10 years ago. And I kind of learned to better appreciate a lot of the games that I previously probably would have ignored. And personally, that was not a easy journey per se. I spent a lot of my life, getting in kind of unproductive discussions with people about video games, and at times looking at video games in kind of unproductive ways. So I want to kind of go through and hopefully help you guys, avoid those kind of pitfalls that I ran into. And hopefully that means, you can have better discussions about video games into the future. And then also you might be able to enjoy a game that you previously, found you weren't able to enjoy for whatever reason, right? So today we're really going to be talking about kind of two major things. One is we're going to be talking about communication, and the other thing we're going to do is talk about kind of analyzing. When I say analyzing, that means, not only analyzing the game, but also analyzing ourselves. And why I paired this topic together was really because I feel like these two things kind of feed into each other. So, when you better are able to communicate with people about video games, you can better understand, what video games are trying to do, and you'll also better understand, why you like video games in certain ways as well. So I think it's a really helpful skill to be able to do both of these. But before we get too deep into this topic, I just want to kind of introduce myself a little bit if you're unfamiliar. And how I want to do that is by putting up some video games up here on screen here. We got Super Mario Bros. 3, Mega Man X, Xenogears, Dragon Quest 8, The Last of Us, and Nier Automata. So, 6, I'd say, fairly high-profile games. Obviously, each of these have their own levels of success. But, these are all, kind of well-regarded by certain people within their communities and to some extent on a mainstream sales level as well. But kind of the thread between all these video games is that at some point in my life, I have called these bad video games. And if you know me, it's not too surprising, but, if anybody who doesn't have any familiar with my personality and my taste, kind of look at me and they're just like, oh boy, really? And then so you go and you put another set of games in front of them. You're like Totally Spies, Totally Party, Dirge of Cerberus, Castlevania, My Number 9, Balan Wonderworld. And I'm like, yeah, those are good games. I like these games. I think they're good to great. And then obviously everybody's just like, oh boy. So you get a lot of people who start asking you questions like, hey, are you being contrarian? Are you a fanboy? Are you, somebody who's trying to get attention and things like that? And, it's hard to figure out, how to have conversations that at times don't really line up with how other people feel about games and convey them in the appropriate way. And I think a lot of this comes down to a lot of the language we use when we're talking about video games and how we interpret it. And I think two of the things that we do, or words that we use a lot when talking about video games, is good and bad. And when we say good and bad, we often interpret it as more of an objective statement rather than a subjective one. And I think reality, if you were to do all the definition checks on and everything, bad and good are very much subjective statements, right? But when you say something like, oh, the combat system in this game is bad, or the graphics of this game are bad, I feel like with video game discussions, we often end up in these situations where when you say that, it often means that you're saying it's bad in a way that it's unredeemable. And if somebody does not agree with you on that, then there's kind of something wrong with them in a lot of ways. And while I don't think anyone takes it that intensely, I do think it kind of results in situations where if somebody calls something in a game that you like bad, it kind of can feel like a personal attack. And same thing, with good, if somebody says something is good in a game you don't like, you often kind of just sit there like, oh, really? Like, how could they, think and feel that way kind of thing. And, the kind of objective versus subjective thing is something that I think, is kind of a weird conversation as is. We kind of talk about these types of statements kind of independently from each other, but they're really kind of connected to each other. So I kind of want to talk about, how I think objective statements kind of affect subjective statements and how one leads to another kind of thing. So basically when you have an objective fact about a video game, that kind of leads to a subjective statement about a video game, basically, right? So when you have something like, say, Fortnite, right? Fortnite has one large map. I've never played Fortnite, but I've played a lot of Battle Royale games. If you don't know what a Battle Royale game basically is, there's this one big map. You have 100 or so players usually, and they're all dropping on this map. And there's a bus that in case of Fortnite, a flying bus that kind of goes across the map at different angles with each match. And then everybody kind of jumps off at different points on the map, essentially. And then once everyone's on the ground, there's a circle that comes in. And as that circle comes in, it kind of closes in on a random spot on the map. So, where games end is kind of randomized a little bit. And so once that circle gets small, you have the remaining players, usually it's a third-person shooter, remaining players, coming together and duking it out until there's one person left standing, and that's the winner, right? So that's kind of the general idea around battle royales. And so, again, each of these games have their own, number of maps, but usually it's a very small number, but we're going to stick with one map for the sake of this video at least. So you have that objective statement about there being one large map. But how you react to that is kind of where the subjective thing comes in, right? So if you look at that one large map aspect and you have negative feelings about it, they're repetitive maps, right? You are playing these matches over and over and over again, and you are dropping on the exact same map over and over and over again. You're going to see all the same things again and again and again. And it's tiring, right? And then you also have excessive downtime. There's 100 players, but this is a large map. And if you don't land near somebody, you could potentially spend an entire game, going around picking up stuff for loot and things like that, but then not really engaging with anyone. So you spend a whole, 20, 30 minutes, essentially doing nothing in a lot of ways, just preparing until the actual encounter. So there's a ton of downtime in these. But obviously you could also interpret, the fact that this game has one map in a different way, where it's hey, there's a diverse progression that kind of comes with the elements of this map, right? So while you might not have, on a game with multiple maps, that much different of kind of the things you interact with on a map, all at once, like say for example, if you're playing Call of Duty map, nothing within that map changes how you interact with the environment. But in the case of a one large map thing with Fortnite and this closing circle and things like that, a wall that's in the middle of the field by default might just be a thing for cover, but depending on, where that wall is in the context of the circle, it actually changes kind of the properties of that obstacle, right? So you have, this wall suddenly becomes a death trap if you're stuck on the other side of it, right? Or you can use it as a tool to kind of pressure the enemies as the circle comes in and they have to get out from behind the wall kind of thing. So that object that in a normal, game that has a smaller map, wouldn't really have a lot of different properties to it, suddenly becomes a really diverse obstacle in a lot of ways. And then also you can have higher tension too, right? So while, the downtime is there, that downtime acts as a contrast to the tense moments of a game. So when you actually get to those higher tension moments, it feels a lot more intense, because if you're just, in a Call of Duty map, that a smaller one, not the Battle Royale one, but a smaller one, and you're just shooting people all the time, right? It doesn't really, there's no downtime. So the entire map is just high tension all the time. So there's not really that kind of up-down element where, it would get your adrenaline rushing in some way. So this is kind of what I think are the basics of kind of objective versus subjective statements when it comes to video games in a lot of ways. But I think one thing we often do is we get tricked sometimes in thinking that something that I would call accepted truths are objective, because they are not. There are a lot of things that we generally agree to be good or bad things about video games, but, how somebody interprets them can actually be pretty different. And the one I always like to use is frame rate for video games. This is basically determines, what speed a game runs at. So if you are playing a game that's 30 frames per second on console, that's basically, is how smooth the image is. But then if you play a game on PC that's 60 frames per second, it'll look smoother on PC. And the lower that frame rate gets, there's not really a lot of benefit to there being a lower frame rate. There are some exceptions that I don't want to really go into that right now, honestly. But, for the sake of this conversation, there's really not a lot of reason for a game to have a lower frame rate outside of just the hardware it's on and if it's capable of handling it in a lot of ways. So we might accept that as technically a bad thing about a video game if that frame rate's lower, but how that frame rate is lower, and how that impacts individuals, is different, right? It's not something that somebody who's used to playing a game at 120 frames per second on a PC, they may be immensely impacted by any kind of frame drops, and they may be bothered by that to the point that they won't be able to play a game because this is too choppy, this is not what I want to see, and there's, it's not what I'm used to at seeing games, and that just kind of ruins the experience for them, right? But then you have people like me who's I could play a video game at 15 frames per second, and it's as long as I know what's happening on screen, I do not care. So yes, we would generally agree frame rate is a good thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the worst part of a game kind of thing, right? And you can kind of apply this to a lot of aspects of a game where we all value different aspects of a game at different levels. And so while it may be easy to say this is kind of a accepted truth, something's good or bad about a video game, that doesn't necessarily mean the impact of it is the same per person in a lot of ways. So I want to kind of get that kind of objective, subjective thing out of the way so you kind of get an idea of where I'm coming from, because I think it's important here as we talk about, actual discussions with other people about video games. So the first thing I want to show up here on screen for you guys is which is the better RPG. We got the hit video game Final Fantasy VII, which, is one of the most important RPGs in the Western Hemisphere because it really introduced JRPGs to a mainstream audience in a way that, while this Final Fantasy had been around before, really hadn't reached before. And then you have Quest 64, which, is probably best known for the contrast of the Nintendo 64 to the Super Nintendo, where the Super Nintendo had an immense, great catalog of RPGs that are universally kind of accepted as good. And then you get to the Nintendo 64 and there's almost no RPGs. And then you get a game like Quest 64, which, by most people's, standards is kind of a subpar RPG at best. We're going to get into that a little bit more here and how other people feel about it. But I think that's kind of the general sentiment around it. So if you're paying attention at the beginning of the presentation, you might be like, oh, I already know what you're gonna choose, but actually I like Final Fantasy VII better between these two video games. But what I like is not the point of what I want to talk about here. I actually want to talk about a conversation I eavesdropped in on. Actually, joined a Quest 64 Discord group, and they were talking about why they viewed Quest 64 as a better video game than Final Fantasy VII, and it was kind of a fascinating conversation to eavesdrop on, but it's really easy, as somebody who's more in line with the mainstream opinion about video games, it's really easy to kind of write that off and scoff at it, right? So you look at it and that's not even a conversation worth entertaining in a lot of ways. And it's easy for us to do that if we have our preconceived notions of how people should feel about these video games, right? But in reading what they thought, I really started to see what they meant in a lot of ways. And a big part of this was really kind of down to the combat system of the game. And if you haven't seen Quest 64 before, Quest 64 is this kind of, I'd say fairly linear RPG. You got Brian here, largely kind of just running forward the whole time, so not a lot to the exploration of the game, in my opinion at least. But it's got this really cool kind of semi-real-time battle system where each character acts on their turn like any other RPG or turn-based RPG, but you can kind of move around during combat. You can do things like dodge attacks this way, and you can also line up your attacks being at the right angle. I think there's a spell right here I use where I use rolling rock, and then I don't line it up right, so it misses one of the guys. So there's kind of like this neat action-oriented element to this combat system. And there's actually this really cool elemental system as well. So you can see there's like this diamond on screen of different elements, and those are mapped to the C buttons on the Nintendo 64 controller, and each direction represents an element. So how you cast spells in this game is by putting in directional inputs on the C buttons to essentially combine different elements to create different spells in the game. And it's a pretty cool system. And unfortunately, it's a little unbalanced. The spell I use here, Avalanche, is definitely the most broken in the game, so that's what you usually spam most of the time. But like, you can definitely see like what this game is doing in really interesting ways. And then Brian goes off and runs down the cave in a linear fashion as Brian does, right? But then you have like Final Fantasy VII, right? In Final Fantasy VII, like a flashy video game. Like we're gonna see 2 limit breaks here. We got Braver and Beat Rush here from Tifa. And, you know, it's really cool to see in a lot of ways, but, you know, it's a menu-driven RPG, and so, you know, once everyone's kind of done, there's just a lot of time where everyone's just kind of like standing around, right, waiting for something to happen. And it's you know, just kind of a different experience, and a lot of what a game like Final Fantasy relies on is the prep work, right? What you're doing in the menus and things like that. And so, you know, you're creating these builds for these characters, and there's an execution layer in combat. Don't get me wrong in that way, but it's just like a different type of execution. Like Quest 64 is definitely a much more active game in terms of like the player interacting with it and things like that. So when you're talking about like if Quest 64 is a better game than Final Fantasy VII, right? You really are starting to like look at it and say like, well, what do I value in a game? And if you value the combat and the engaging combat, or at least engaging the way that Quest 64 is over everything else, then obviously, you know, Quest 64 is the right choice. And you know, there's a lot of other differences between these games. You know, there's a more of a whimsical nature to Quest 64, and you may prefer that, right? But you know, as long as you prefer those elements, it means you're going to value that more, and it's going to be more important to you in a lot of ways. So it's like something that you just have to kind of think about, that, you know, everybody is approaching these games in different ways, and how we interpret them is often, you know, very different, and you know, we don't necessarily have the same requirements for a bar of quality, and that made to change how we receive each of these games, right? And so while they were having a conversation about like why Quest 64 was better than Final Fantasy VII, I mean, the reality is that, you know, this isn't a competition, right? This is not about, you know, which game is better, really. Like Final Fantasy VII and Quest 64 are both video games that exist, and everybody can go and play them, right? And as long as everybody can go and play them and have a good time and pick what they want to enjoy out of them, like everybody's a winner, right? There's really no need to sit here and like try to, you know, de-level or like degrade somebody's opinion on the game that they like, right? And so I think a lot of what we do with games and conversing about games really is kind of misguided when we start asking about questions about like what's better, what is like you know, the more impressive experience or things like that. You know, I think the reality is that when we talk about games, we really should probably just be asking more questions with other people if we are wanting to like kind of discuss between two different video games and try to better understand like why somebody else would enjoy the game, rather than sitting there and trying to prove them wrong for preferring a video game, right? So I think a big thing when talking about video games is, you know, making learning a priority. And so while you may have your thoughts about Quest 64 and things like that, I think if you are the one being curious and engaging with someone, you definitely should be the one asking questions. Like, you know, they're not really there, like, especially if you're the one starting the conversation, they're not really there, you know, looking for your opinion per se, right? Like, the better thing is to ask questions about their opinion. And I think one of the best things you can do when you do this is to not bake in negative statements. This is something I'm actually really bad about in a lot of ways, where I will often say like, oh, I don't like this about a video game. I'm curious, why do you like it? And especially if it's a game that's like actively getting kind of attacked at times, it might go ahead and put them on the defensive before you guys even have a chance to have a conversation about it, right? So I think it's better to just kind of leave those kind of negative comments out of your questions and leave it to be a more neutral conversation, so you get more information that's not so much defending a point as it is just explaining, you know, how somebody feels about something. I think as you start, you know, asking questions, one of the things that you can do if you're having trouble figuring out like what are good questions and what are bad questions is is do kind of like a how versus why test, I guess, where if you're asking questions that feel like you're saying, how could you like Quest 64? How could you prefer it over Final Fantasy 7? That's really a way to phrase a question that's going to like shut the conversation down, right? You're really kind of asking what's wrong with you is what you're asking when you're saying those kind of things. So if you find that the answer to your question is more about, kind of demeaning the individual or kind of demeaning their opinion or saying that their opinion is wrong, or if you find that would be the typical response in a lot of ways, that's probably not the best way to ask it. And so really, I think that the best way is when you're asking questions that are like, why, right? Why do you like Quest 64? Why do you prefer Quest 64 over Final Fantasy 7, right? And when you ask those questions, you're asking for information. You're not really attacking the person kind of thing. Another important thing is to not look for like gotcha statements a lot of times. So, we're all humans, right? And we all have a hard time explaining ourselves. And a lot of times we don't really know why we do the things we do, why we like the things we like, right? So like say if they like a mechanic in one game, but then there's a similar mechanic in another game that they don't like, rather than sit there and be like, oh, well, like this game does it, so why are you happy about it? Like in this case, or how using it more as a way to like kind of undermine their opinion about one of the video games or something like that. I think you instead should be asking like, why is the difference between these two games? What is the difference between these two games and how does that change your opinion on them? And they may not have a good answer for you a lot of times, right? But I think the big thing is you don't want to ever sit there and like be like, hey, that's not good enough of an answer to like address that contradiction. I think that's just like a really negative way to come across. So I think it's always important to like make sure you're fostering that conversation, and if you can make that connection for them to see if they have some thoughts about it. And who knows, maybe in the future they might actually be able to come back to you and like say, oh, I thought about it and kind of thing, right? But it's always important to remember that, like, not everyone cares, right? And especially if you're reaching out to random people on social media, like, you may be asking them questions and they may not want to respond, and that's not them, trying to cover up their opinion or anything like that. They just might not care that you know why they feel the way they do, right? Especially if they don't know who you are, then, like, what business do you really have in knowing that? And you may be like, well, I just want to know, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're required to let you know, right? You got to really respect that boundary there. Another thing, you may get a response from them and they might seem on edge or skeptical. And if they do seem that way, there's a very good chance that, people, especially if it's a game with like an unpopular opinion, there's a chance people have approached them about this before and have not had a conversation in good faith, right? And it ultimately results in, them being skeptical of future conversations. So they might not necessarily be open and willing to talk, and they might, immediately go on the defensive no matter how well you ask your question. But the big thing, I think, more than anything, is just knowing when to stop engaging with somebody if they aren't responding positively. The reality is that, if it seems like you're not getting what you want out of a conversation, and it seems like they don't want to be there either, then, it's better to just kind of let it go and not really worry about it. And I think no matter what, though, you'll always be polite. If they do kind of snap back at you about something, or if they ignore you or something, I think the best thing you can do is just, be as polite as possible. And especially if they kind of leave off on a negative statement, it can be good to leave, to respond with something that's positive. And don't focus on like the things you did not give them. Like if they're like, if you're just like, I just wanted to know, your opinion on this. Like, don't sit there and pretend like they're the ones in the wrong about this, right? Just thank them for the information they did give you and say like, thank you for, providing, this insight. And what I find a lot of times is if I leave on that positive statement and it was like somebody who was kind of snapping back at me about something, even though I just was kind of like asking what I felt like was a proper question, right? That they'll be like, hey, I'm sorry, I just assumed you were here to say something, negative or something like that, right? And they may actually respond to your question later. But, again, if they don't respond to your question, you have to be polite, don't worry about it. It's none of your business, really, in a lot of ways. So I think it's really important if you are, you don't, well, two things. One, if you are somebody who engages or starts bad faith conversations, to not start a bad faith conversation in the first place. And then also, if you are being addressed by somebody who clearly is not, having a good faith conversation with you, that you kind of disengage from that conversation. So if somebody's coming at you and they're really only focused on who is right, then that usually means it's going to be a bad faith conversation, especially if it's like an opinion oriented kind of thing or a subjective statement kind of thing. If they're arguing that you're wrong about your opinion, then it's already kind of a bad start. Again, if you're doing this too, you really shouldn't do this. Try to get your conversation back on track if you're the one starting at this kind of thing. The other thing you really want to worry about or really kind of watch out for is presenting, quote, objective evidence. So you'll see this sometimes with like people who will present Metacritic score. And I don't want to poo-poo Metacritic scores. I think Metacritic scores are great, but they're great for showing a snapshot in time of how like the gaming media reacted to a video game and what the gaming media's, values were. And when you start aggregating all these scores together, it becomes reflective of what would be kind of the mainstream gaming press's opinion. And, that's great. The Metacritic score is great shorthand for a variety of things. In the moment, for people who are just looking for a quick thing to buy, it can be a great shorthand for looking for a great game that would, generally line up with most game players' values. And it also is a great thing historically, where you can kind of look at Metacritic and say, how was something received? But Metacritic is not a bar of quality. It's just how it was received, right? So if anybody's sending you a Metacritic thing saying, look, the Metacritic score is low, and so it's objectively a bad game, they're not using the Metacritic score correctly, unfortunately. And I would say disengage from that conversation. And also for yourself, don't use it as evidence unless you're talking about the reception around a game, not the actual game's quality. The other thing you need to worry about too is basically people who use authoritative people as like a way to justify their opinion over yours. So the example I really like to use for this is the Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. So, Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, at the time when it came out was kind of, disliked to some degree because of its aesthetics. There's other problems with the game too, but aesthetics were a big part of people's frustrations with this video games. And thankfully in the modern day, we can say, we understand that the Wind Waker is a great looking game and there's a lot of artistic merit to it and things like that. And it's definitely held up over a lot of other video games. But one of the kind of funny things about this is that in recent years, it's been kind of revealed that like Miyamoto did not like how this video game looked. If you don't know, Miyamoto's like the father of Zelda in a lot of ways. And, if people knew that at the time, they absolutely would use that as ammo for like, oh, they made a bad decision because literally the dude who made Zelda also doesn't like this style, right? Because he was like preferred something that looked like Twilight Princess, basically. So, just because somebody is an authoritative person in that question, especially when it comes to video games where, we're just here for entertainment and stuff like that, it's not really worth like it's not an objective source on that thing, right? Like people change and people realize certain things are actually good decisions even after they may have initially thought something was a mistake in a lot of ways. So just a good thing to remember, not to let people kind of use a developer's voice or a major critic's voice to kind of like silence your opinion or devalue your opinion more than anything like that. And kind of the last part of the bad faith conversation thing is my least favorite thing about video game conversations in the modern day, and that is the dunk zone. The dunk zone is this period of time where, for whatever reason, related to the game or not, related to the press cycle, related to how it's marketed, doesn't really matter. There's drama that forms around a video game, right? And then what happens is people get emotionally invested in this game looking as bad as possible, right? And so what they'll do is they'll find every little thing about a video game and try to use that as ammo against it. So essentially they'll come in and they just try their best to tear a game down in a lot of ways. And, I think we all, as humans, we often, have fun at the expense of others. And sometimes that can be a person, that can be a type of person, that can be, media, things like that. And I think, as much as we all would like to think we don't do that, I think a lot of us do. And I think that video games are really no exception here of that, having fun at the expense of a video game, while as an inanimate object in some ways, also it's having fun at the expense of the developers in a lot of ways, right? But what happens is, well, that's not necessarily, I don't really want to it's human nature, so I don't want to say what's good and bad and what shouldn't be done in that regard. But what I can say is that this is my personal least favorite time in a video games discussion, because it feels like a lot of times people are really trying to dunk on a game, and largely a lot for like, kudos and public acceptance in a lot of ways, right? Like people who go and they'll like publish stories about like how Babylon's Fall only has like one player on Steam, right? Or people who go and find one issue in a video game and just like blow it up on Twitter or something like that, or sometimes they'll take a picture of like, some weird situation that is not really that bad, but they try to manipulate it in a way that it's actually worse than it is, right? It's like the whole clipping thing, right? It's a whole thing. So, I really don't like the dunk zone. I think it is the worst thing that is part of modern video game discussion. And if you are on the other side of it, unfortunately, a lot of people will take that as an opportunity to take you down too, right? When I was did my video about Babylon, or not Babylon's Fall, Babylon's Wonderworld, I joined the Discord, and they would have people that come in the Discord just basically kick up dirt and basically harass people. And I also got called in my Babylon Wonderworld video as somebody who's a part of a coordinated effort to help that game sell better, which is such a bizarre thing. But anyways, people are going to try to tear you down with it. And what sucks about this is I think there's no good response to this. This is like internet culture and mob culture. And it's something that I think you just got to kind of keep your nose out of at this point. Like, it sucks. I think it sucks that you can't talk about a video game you like at launch sometimes. But, that's just how it is. And so, I would say on the bright side, look at it this way. 3 months from now, people will not care for the most part. And, you can have proper discussions about that video game, kind of once all the people have run off and they're off, getting upset at the latest Pokemon game set or something like that, right? So, once the Eye of Sauron has moved on, then, you're free to talk a little bit more. But it may be years until you have anyone actually take you seriously, unfortunately. So, I'm really not a fan of the dunk zone at all. But in the end, I think what's most important about discussing video games is just remembering that, no one can contest someone's enjoyment of a game. The reality is if you had fun, you had fun. And we often use words, I think, to kind of de-emphasize, our fun with the game, right? We talk about how games are guilty pleasures and things like that, right? But the reality is if you enjoyed yourself, you enjoyed yourself. And just because a game isn't the best execution of something, doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have value in a lot of ways. And I honestly, myself, I do this to myself sometimes where I look back at some games I used to like, and I'll say oh, I was stupid for liking that game. But the reality is that I was a different person 10 years ago, right? And why I liked a game was different than why I like a game today. And there's nothing wrong with my opinion back then. And it's just, I had a different background and different set of values. And that is the reality of it. And so I think a lot of times when we look back at, old video games and we kind of question why people liked them or why people didn't like them sometimes, it's easy to forget that, the people are made up of experiences in a lot of ways, and those experiences can lead to you enjoying something in a different way than somebody else, right? And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind. So yeah, but one of the reasons I wanted to really focus on that kind of communication side first and foremost is because I really think, being able to better communicate about games really can help you better appreciate games. Knowing why people like games can really help your understanding of why a game functions the way it does. And also, it can help you see games through new perspectives that you wouldn't be able to see if you just kind of jumped in on a game on your own first and foremost. And while you may not necessarily like the game, at least can kind of see what the value in that game is, kind of thing. And we can also start applying, that kind of how versus why sentiment to questions we ask about games. When we are looking at games, I think it's really important that we're not asking questions of how could a game have been made? How could they have made this design decision? Because I think at that point when you're doing that, you're really saying, you're really kind of insulting everybody in the process and saying, why were you all so stupid to make this decision, right? I feel like that's how it feels when you ask the question of how could they have done that? They should have never done that, right? I think it's kind of an intense way to address issues that come up with games. So, when you're approaching a game and you run into something that you don't understand or you don't like, you can really, I think the best thing you do is ask the question, why is it designed this way, right? And sometimes the answer is not always satisfying, right? Sometimes it literally is just like, hey, a game didn't have the budget to do the thing you wanted to do. But sometimes it is a design choice, and you can kind of better understand, why a game was designed a way when you sit down and think about why it was designed that way. So one of the biggest challenges we have to appreciating games, I think, is that we put up walls with games we play. And two of those biggest walls, I think, are one, focusing on like surface level impressions of video games. So we will often sit down and play a video game for a brief period of time, and we'll make assumptions about it, right? Because not everyone has all the free time in the world, right? So we obviously have to kind of fast track our way through our experiences, and sometimes that means making quick decisions about games. So we'll run into situations where we don't like something, make an assumption about it, and then that is just how we feel about that game going forward. The other thing we also run into is a lack of interest in adapting. So I think this is especially true if especially when you're looking at like more modern day stuff where a lot of games are designed around very similar language. And then so if a game doesn't necessarily, come to you with the answers in the language you're expecting, then it is something that is, deemed as poorly designed in a lot of ways. And so while a lot of modern video games have a lot of similar language now, thankfully, it makes them more accessible than ever. It does mean that if a game tries to do something different, it can actually be hard to adapt to it. And we often, I think, stand against adapting to things in games sometimes because we're like, this is how video games work, and this is how I view video games. And that value of, what you think makes a video game and what makes a good video game, changes over time with different audience and things like that. So I think that's like one of the big things is just like not wanting to adapt and understand, why certain decisions were made and how you can change how you approach that experience to make a better experience for you. So to break down those walls, I think there's kind of like three major things that I usually try to recommend to people. One is just like reposition your mindset. I think we all think about mindset when we play games, when we sit down and like, oh, do we want to play an RPG? It's easy to have that question and answer that. Like, I'm not in the mood for a 50-hour RPG right now, right? But I think when we start thinking about games more deeply, we often sometimes get really caught up in our mindsets, and it can result in situations where we're not adaptable in that situation. So the example I always like to use is like Resident Evil 6, which, was a very survival horror focused franchise initially when it first came out. And, but as time went on, the game got more action oriented. And by the time Resident Evil 6 came out, in some ways that is entirely an action movie, right? And the way we were talking about that game and reviewing that game when it came out was we were still looking at it as a survival horror game. And, there's value in that to some extent, I think. And I think there's a great conversation to be like, how much does like a franchise inform your view of a game when you come in? But the reality is that Resident Evil 6 was not a survival horror game. And so instead of adapting to that, a lot of people I think just hated it for what it wasn't, right? But if you look at it as an action game, like as an action, in some ways, Monster Hunter inspired third-person shooter, it's a fantastic video game. But it's just, it's not doing what people thought it was doing, but nobody would like adjust their mindset. And that was an experience I had where the first time I played Resident Evil 6, I did not like it. But once I went down and replayed it as an action game, I actually really, really enjoyed it. So I think repositioning your mindset is like really important if you can. Another big thing is seeing if you can mitigate issues that you run into. I don't know if this is as big of an issue today, but I do feel like for a long time we had this weird kind of sentiment in the gaming community online, at least, where like a game was intended to be played a specific way. So we'd be like, oh, you got to play it on this difficulty. Oh, you got to play it this way or else, kind of thing. And while there are often like options to kind of manage how those games could be played, the auto battle system in Final Fantasy 13 can be turned off and things like that. I think sometimes we would resist those changes. And sometimes a game is designed a specific way and it's good to appreciate it for how it was designed. But if you have the option to change something, you find that, how the game was initially presented to you, is not appealing to you. It's not necessarily a bad thing to go and like change a setting, right? If you want a game to be more difficult, go crank that difficulty up, right? I think there's nothing wrong with that. And I think it's all the more reason that you should, utilize those things that those options that you have as a player in a lot of ways. I think it's also important to assess the real impact of issues, especially like in the dunk zone. It can get really easy to overemphasize problems in games. If you have a problem in a game that shows up and it's like a 30-second issue in a video game and then it never shows up again, or shows up like maybe 3 more times out of the experience, but it's like a 30-hour video game, right? Like the reality is, how much does that really like affect the experience if it happens like 1 minute on the entire experience, right? And I think sometimes we get really hung up on these design choices that often are kind of things that stand out because they are kind of the biggest pain points in games a lot of times. But the reality is that they're such a minor part of that experience, it doesn't really matter. Now I think it's important to, like I said in this thing, assess and make sure it's the real impact, because there are minor issues that can have greatly extensive effects on a video game. So I'm not saying forgive everything, but I think forgive things that largely are kind of irrelevant to the experience as a whole. I think overall, I think that's really important. However, these 3 things I think are something that unfortunately it's very hard to do, like when you're playing a game a lot of times, and it often can take a long time to kind of figure out how to do these things, and sometimes you may not necessarily know if the way you're repositioning your mindset is correct, or if the settings you change to mitigate it actually improve the experience or not. Like, it can take time to go through these steps. So I think one of the easiest things you can do if you are running into a problem where you're running into a game and you just find that you're not enjoying it is do a little bit of research. 2 things I always recommend. 1, go and look at like what people are saying online, but go look at positive opinions, I will say. Like, if you don't like a game, you already don't like it. Don't go look at things that are just going to like reinforce your opinion on a game, right? Go look at things that are going to give you a different perspective of how a game can be played. Go and look at things that can tell you like what are the things that are valued in that game, and see if you can value those things too, right? And so hopefully, when you revisit a game, after reading 20, 30 minutes online, you can have a great experience with that game. The other thing is to find information on confusing elements, right? So there's some things that in games that I think we often will run into where like, hey, there's not a great set of information in this game about a mechanic or something like that, right? Or there's not a great tutorial system, and we'll get confused and we don't know how something works, and we get frustrated and we'll ignore it, or just kind of write off that mechanic as a bad mechanic in a lot of ways. And sometimes if you go read like a Reddit post that just explains it in like, the handful of paragraphs, you can avoid that issue where you don't know what you're doing in a game and just be like, oh, okay, well, I read this really quick and now I have a better understanding of it, right? And I think there's a great criticism of like how video game tutorials are handled in games. So like, I'm not saying you should ignore that if you're like, talking about a video game and saying, hey, I wasn't, thrilled with how the tutorial experience was. But I think, if you can self-help yourself outside, I think there's kind of no reason not to today with the accessibility we have to how people, how people approach a game in some ways. But it's also important to know that like it's okay to not care, man. Like if you aren't enjoying yourself, it's perfectly fine to say this isn't for me, right? Like, don't force yourself to like a video game. The bigger thing is to give you different perspectives on a game and see if you can like it. But don't sit there and like, force a pill down your throat if that's not something you want to do. Like, I'm somebody who will stick with video games all the way through, but that's my personal business and how I kind of experience video games. For most people, you just want to have a good time. And I think that's what's most important. It's like, are you having a good time? And if you're not having a good time, there's nothing wrong with stepping away from a video game. And you might view it as kind of a waste of time going through these steps if you didn't enjoy something. But I think the reality is that like, you may still learn something, right? You may still learn why people enjoy these games. And so while you may not improve your personal experience with the video games, you might better improve your understanding of a video game, and it might also better improve your ability to talk about that video game and understand why other people like it, and also communicate why you don't like it, right? And I think that can be like a big help if you're invested in talking about video games online. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think the most important thing out of everything here is this: to have empathy for people and for games, right? If you are looking for ways to demonize or, cut down people and things like that, you're not going to have a great time talking about video games online. You may get the shorthand, enjoyment of just being like, oh, I feel better in this because I feel like I'm the smarter person in this situation or something like that, right? Like whatever. But, I think it's important to respect other people and understand how things work, because the reality is we're all just human beings, right? And like, like even if you have a lot of experience with games, that doesn't necessarily mean your opinion's more valuable over other people's opinions, right? Like there's so much value in people's opinions as somebody who's fresh to a series, somebody who's deeply invested in a series and things like that. So some people be like, oh, they've only played one game in this series, and so that their opinion's like not valid. But no, their opinion's absolutely valid. They're just coming from a different place than you. And for games themselves, I think it's really easy for us to view them as inanimate objects that just like don't have any people involved. But I think, the reality is that we should probably give games, every chance they can to succeed, or at least a little bit of a chance, right? Don't immediately just shove them to the side if they don't cater to your every need. I think it's good to think about games and try to better understand the way they're designed so you can, see, what the thought process was behind these games. And hopefully, you will be able to better enjoy them as well. And I think it's also important to respect games because, there's people behind them too. And like, I think it does kind of suck to some degree of just like developers getting, their game trashed on the internet, right? And I'm sure that it's not something that like feels great, but I think it's always important though to not, cover up your feelings about games though. Don't cover up your feelings about games. Don't cover up your opinions. I think it's important to convey what you feel, but I think it's just good to make sure you're doing it in a respectful manner and have empathy for others. So anyways, that's it for this presentation. Again, thank you guys so much. OneControllerPort.com is the website. And the YouTube channel as well. And I also started up the PCFX fan club more recently. It's like basically in some ways kind of like the ultimate execution of these ideas where like the PCFX is a system that is incredibly, I'd say, or at least was incredibly undermined in a lot of ways in on the internet. And so trying to better understand that system and why the decisions were made about that system and how certain games got made and things like that is like super important, I think. So that's a big thing of what I'm doing here. So before I wrap up though, so I had two questions that came up during the panel. I'm going to try to remember them as well as I can off the top of my head here. But the first one was basically talking about, how to deal with characters that were kind of talked about in a negative sentiment, specifically around social issues. So the character specifically they mentioned was Abby, I believe, from The Last of Us 2, and I forget the other one, but it was an openly trans character in The Last of Us 2, and I believe a muscular woman in Last of Us 2. And the fact that like some people kind of undermine those characters' importance because of who they are in some ways. And I think the thing I kind of more or less conveyed was that like, well, I think the first thing you need to determine is like, is it a bad faith conversation, right? And if you're talking to somebody who has no, respect for those types of individuals in the real world or something like that, or they have hangups with those types of individuals in the real world, then I would say, as much that's a social issue at that point, right? And it kind of gets outside of video games, and that starts talking about, other people and their existence and things like that. And I think the reality is that, if somebody is arguing with it as a video game point, there's a greater issue that they need to overcome with their own thoughts and feelings about that type of character than something that you likely can do. So if you're asking questions about that, you're asking questions more about a social issue, I think, from them rather than the video game itself in a lot of ways. However, as somebody who does not like The Last of Us characters personally, I only played the first one, but I just did not care for most of the people in that game. It could just be that it's just a different set of values, right? So like characters are a really important part of the Last of Us series, and if you don't like those characters, it's pretty clear that somebody's not going to like The Last of Us, right? And the kind of thing I kind of come back to. I haven't thought about this a ton, so I don't have a great answer, but like, I think I prefer Japanese storytelling in a lot of ways, just because I grew up on so many Japanese games and Japanese anime. And so when I see like more Western style storytelling, I think it can be harder for me to kind of grip onto it in a lot of ways. And so the characters of The Last of Us were not particularly, exciting characters to me. I prefer, the more dad and daughter stories from like the series like Nier or father-son story in terms of, Attack of the Friday Monsters and things like that. So there's definitely reasons why people can prefer those characters that aren't, related to the social issues surrounding those characters, right? So, but I think the big thing first and foremost is, making sure it's not a conversation that at that point is beyond the video game in a lot of ways. And if they are, a bad actor in some ways, just not that it's not a bad faith conversation. And the reality might be is that at this time with where they're at in terms of their feelings about those types of people, that they're just not there for that conversation in a video game sense at that point. The second question was basically asking, when I think about characters in video games, what is the best way to approach, conveying, I think, how I feel about a character. And, I think this is something that's different for everybody in a lot of ways, where essentially, if you need to sit there and have like an internal monologue with yourself or write, notes in a diary about a character, or just literally bullet points about a character, I think that's something that you can absolutely do if you want to kind of, better understand why you like a character in a lot of ways. For me personally, I think it's largely subconscious. Like a lot of times I will play a game and I'll think about it that time, and then I go off and do something else, and then I come back to that thing, however many months later, and my subconscious has done work and just delivers me a bunch of information about, how I feel about something, right? And so just like having time away from it at times can really help me. And I think it's part of why I prefer reviewing games after they've been out for a while sometimes, because sometimes just having that time to stew and think over something is important. So, I think every person works differently in terms of how they appreciate things and how they appreciate games and characters and things like that. And that is what is important, is to find what works for you, and that could be the best thing for you. So anyways, that's it. Thank you guys so much for listening. I appreciate it. Hopefully the next panel will actually record it on site properly. But hopefully this was a good substitute for you guys and you enjoyed it here. I did submit another panel that's coming up hopefully in May here, but we'll see what happens with that. But otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great week.